Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, for those watching online now and in the future, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on our Heritage homepage for your future reference. Leading our discussion is Walter Lohman, who is director of our Asian Studies Center. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he leads seminars on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia, as well as the role of Congress in Asian policy. Prior to joining us here, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. He has also served as Senior Professional Republican Staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as a policy aide to Senator John McCain on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks. Well, thank you all for coming out to View from the Hill. You know, we've been doing this program at least every of the 10 years that I've been here. We do it once a year, and I see some of the alumni from the previous iterations of it. It even predates my tenure here by a couple of years, I think, too. I don't think there's been a more interesting time to actually talk about the view of Asia from Capitol Hill and the work that they're doing there. Obviously, a new president in office creating a lot of new policies, creating a little bit of turmoil in our approach to the region, maybe change in the air in that regard. You've had the meetings with Xi Jinping and Abe, the action on TPP. There's just so much up in the air for us to talk about and to look at Congress's perspective on it. And then, as if it wasn't already exciting enough, we had all those great interviews in the last day with Tsai Ing-wen and Donald Trump, which I imagine might come up in the conversation today. So thanks very much for being here. We look forward to talking about all the things that are on the table and responding to questions. But first, we're going to start out with our guests here. We're very lucky to have Igor Krestin from the office of Senator Cory Gardner. Igor is National Security Advisor for the Senator, and he serves as a staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and the International Cybersecurity Policy. The name's gotten longer since I worked there, but it's a lot of responsibility now in that subcommittee. Igor previously had served with Senator Mark Kirk as legislative assistant. He worked at BGR consulting firm downtown, and he was at AEI, sort of our sister organization, I guess you could say in some ways. And then Jamie's going to speak second. Jamie is counselor for Foreign and National Security Affairs for Senator Marco Rubio. Before this, Jamie was executive director of the Foreign Policy Institute from early 2009. He was at the Bush administration, the National Security Council, 2008, 2009. And before that, he was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So Jamie brings some executive branch experience to his congressional perspective. So let me turn it over to Igor. He'll get us started, about 10 minutes or so, Jamie, and then we'll have a discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, and it's great to be here. This is a great program you do, and I was privileged to be here, I think, a couple of years ago. Yeah. Thank you all for being here today on such a beautiful day. Probably have other better things to do, but you're here listening to us. Well, I'm going to try to keep my remarks pretty short and informal because I feel like could be a lot of really great Q&A here given the news that was made over the last 24 hours, but we have a news cycle now that seems to be repeating every 24 hours with very different things. But as Walter mentioned, my boss, Senator Gardner, serves as the chair of the East Asian Pacific Subcommittee. This is his second term. And in that, this is a region that he sort of recognized, and I think Jamie's boss and others as a region where we have the most strategic opportunities and strategic challenges. And I'll touch on a few of them. First and foremost, the biggest challenge that we see is North Korea. This is something that this new administration is trying to come up with a new policy. We now have, instead of strategic patience, we have maximum pressure. That's something that we've been calling on in Congress for quite a while. Our bosses worked last Congress to pass a comprehensive sanctions bill that gives the administration, we feel, the tools they need to impose a lot of pressure, a lot of economic pressure, a lot of diplomatic pressure on the North Korean regime to with the ultimate goal of peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Stress that term because, you know, as I'm sure you've seen, any kind of kinetic options are very tough and should really be reserved for a situation where all the other options have been exhausted, diplomatic options, economic options, and so forth. And so, that challenge is the first and foremost challenge, I think, of this administration. This is why they conducted the review and came away with this maximum pressure and engagement strategy. And from my boss's perspective, we're ready to support that, ready to have the administration sort of show us what that pressure means. One of the things that my boss has been calling for is the imposition of secondary sanctions on entities that are aiding the regime. This is something that was done when we tried to bring Iran to the negotiating table. We feel that the part bringing them succeeded. The part of negotiating a good deal, we can have arguments over whether that's the case or not, but the pressure certainly worked. And for that, we really require a whole of government effort. It takes investigators from the Treasury's Department, Office of Foreign Assets Control, and others. It takes the State Department. It takes a lot of expertise to find these things. It takes our intelligence agencies, and we encourage the administration to turn all those spigots on now, and if they need additional resources, I think Congress would be happy to provide them. And if it's a matter of that, so that's and obviously we support any kind of sort of show of force exercises. The THAAD deployment is something that Senator Gardner strongly supported. And any other measures we could do to build the trilateral alliance between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, that really helps as well. Any kind of initiatives, trilateral ballistic missile defense exercises, or any other initiative. We were very pleased to see the JSOMIA agreement finally signed between the ROK and Japan, and we hope that gets fully implemented and not get caught up in a lot of the sort of political issues that happen between the two countries. So then the second challenge that we see is South China Sea and East China Sea as well. This is something that I think you heard yesterday. You heard Admiral Harry Harris speak about at the Senate Armed Services Committee. But this is a situation that really threatens to destabilize the region because there's so many claimants involved, and because it's really a direct sort of challenge to the United States as a Pacific power. You all know the statistics about sort of the reclamation activities and the militarization, and we've all seen images from CSIS and others to show what's really happening. The ruling, the UNCLOS ruling, I think was very clear about rejecting the excessive claims and showing the kind of environmental damage that's being done in those areas. And we really hope that this administration, I think you heard Admiral Harris yesterday say that the freedom of navigation operations are going to resume shortly, and we hope that that's the case because these are the global commons. This is a strategic area for the United States. About $1.3 billion of shipborne trade transits through there. It's critically important economically and obviously strategically. So that's another challenge to watch, and that's something else that the administration is going to need to come up with a comprehensive, consistent policy. We really hope that that's a policy of sort of asserting these very, very claims that are, sort of the global, global commons and common international law. Obviously, we're not a signatory to UNCLOS, but we recognize these rights as common law, and DoD abides by those. And I'll mention the third thing that doesn't nearly get sort of, I think, as much attention as it should, but that's the threat of radicalism in Southeast Asia. And that's something that, again, you heard Admiral Harris talk about. You know, as we try to sort of push ISIS out of the CENTCOM AOR, a lot of them seem to be heading back to Southeast Asia, and we've seen already some terrorist attacks to ISIS-linked militants and so forth. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to work with our allies to confront through other CT programs and other things. And it's a challenge that is one to watch, and I think is very important. And then I'll just very quickly mention that these are just sort of the strategic security challenges, but the other big question is what's happening to what's going to happen to the rebalance? Is there going to be a new policy that this administration is going to adopt that will supplant that will, because the strategic imperatives are still the same. We need to be present in the region. We need to show up. Some very encouraging signs from the visits that Secretary Mattis and Vice President Pence made. Sort of kind of a reassurance tour to our allies. But we need to think about sort of filling the other pieces, the non-DoD pieces, which was the criticism we had of the Obama administration's policy, was that it was very much seemed to be Defense Department driven. And obviously the economic piece of that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's no longer seems to be something that the administration is interested in, to put it sort of mildly. But there is an imperative to engage economically with the region, either in a bilateral format, which is a tougher, because there was some sense. My boss, I supported the TPP, and big reason why he supported it, because it made sense strategically. But they're going to have to come up with a policy, the administration, to make sure that we engage this critical economic region of the world, whether we do that in a U.S. ASEAN format or a bilateral format. We now have a dialogue between Vice President Pence and the Deputy Prime Minister Aso in Japan, which is very positive. So that's the question. And then the third sort of thing, which last but certainly not least, is that we need to promote U.S. values in this region. That is something that we cannot forget. We can't have a transactional policy and not forget about. This is something that I know Senator Rubio has been very forward on, but we can't forget that we have serious human rights challenges in the region. We can't forget that we need to promote transparency, rule of law, all of these issues that benefit U.S. policy as well in the region. So that's part of the reason why my boss is developing this initiative we're calling the Asia Reassurance Initiative, that will combine some of these elements and maybe provide some kind of a framework and guidance where we can work with the administration and in a bipartisan way, because this region really hasn't been, we haven't had a lot of partisan sort of divides on this, and try to come up with a consistent, comprehensive policy that can sort of obviously benefit the United States first and foremost. Say focusing on this region is America first, in a lot of ways. And so I think I'll stop there. I don't know if I went way over time, but
perfect, great, thanks.
Thanks, Walter, and it's good to be back. I also, I think, was on this panel a couple of years ago, and I actually went back and looked at my notes from that discussion, and it was interesting to see how many things have changed, and we've made some progress on. A lot of the same issues are obviously kicking around, even with a new administration. I'll keep it brief, because I think it's just a sign of how much agreement there is in Congress on these issues. I agree with everything Igor said, and my boss certainly has really appreciated Senator Gardner's leadership on these issues, and enjoys working with him on all of the topics related to Asia. So I think this is, Asia policy has been a good experience for me working on the Hill over the last 4 years, mainly because of how bipartisan it is. There's broad bipartisan agreement, and I think if we had one of our Democratic colleagues up here, you'd probably hear them repeat a lot of the same themes that we're going to talk about today. For me, I want to lay out 3 challenges very briefly, and then 3 opportunities. The first challenge I do think we have, and I agree with the challenges that Igor laid out, but stepping back a little bit about just kind of where U.S. Asia policy goes under this new administration, I think those of us who care about the region, who care about America's standing in the Asia Pacific, we need to always be worried about the distraction that always occurs in every administration. I saw this firsthand in the Bush administration. I think the Obama administration, despite the rebalance, struggled with it. And this administration is going to struggle with the same problem. There's always going to be a more urgent crisis. We may have North Korea challenges, obviously, that appear immediate. But at the end of the day, we're going to get drawn back into debates about the Middle East or debates about the Transatlantic Alliance and Russia policy. And I'm not here to say that we should ignore all those other regions and focus solely on the Asia-Pacific, but the reality is I think our play in the Asia-Pacific is a long-term one, and we need to be consistent, maintain our alliances, and continue to focus on the region over decades to come, and that's often hard for any administration, just given the way our government is structured. So that's the perennial challenge. Combined with that is the perception, which is not tied to the Trump administration, it's one that's been around for a while, of a possible American decline post 9/11, the U.S. being bogged down in other regions. Obviously, I think Beijing promotes this narrative in the region when it can, that in the long run it's a safer bet for countries, especially ones that don't have formal alliance relationships with the U.S., to maybe to play both sides or to partner with Beijing. And so that's another challenge that this administration is going to face as it determines its Asia policy. A second challenge, obviously, Igor talked about North Korea. I think North Korea is, given the recent developments of the nuclear and missile program, something we need to focus on. I do worry, though, that North Korea can also become a distraction, and if we see our entire Asia policy entirely through North Korea, that could end up, just again from my personal experience, going back to the Bush administration working on counterproliferation. Every administration in the last several decades has tried to tackle North Korea, has ultimately spent a lot of time on North Korea and not really come out with a positive outcome. I hope that changes, but we also, I think, need to make sure that even as we try to work with China to pressure North Korea, that our entire approach to the region, our entire approach to Beijing doesn't only become about North Korea. And so I think that's something that we just need to think about here in these early months as this administration engages on that threat. The third challenge, I think, which perhaps might be the greatest right now, and Igor touched on this as well, is post-TPP, we need a clear economic agenda for the region. And this was something that was missing. I think even if you talk to veterans of the Obama administration, they put all their eggs in the TPP basket, even knowing that that was risky and knowing that the politics of TPP were difficult in the Congress. And anyone who goes out to the region, I think, hears this from our allies and partners. They need to know what the U.S. economic agenda is. They need to know that the U.S. is committed economically to the region. There is some hope there even without TPP, I think. I mean, the bilateral FTAs that the administration seems interested in, I think if those are done strategically, if the right countries are prioritized, those discussions begin quickly, I think there's some possibility there. Obviously, we understand that some of our TPP partners may not be interested in that initially, may decide to kind of go ahead with TPP minus the U.S., but I do think that just coming up with that framework, having a plan that can be presented to our allies and partners in the region to show that American economic leadership is not disappearing is essential. Because again, there we face a situation where Beijing is obviously pursuing its own economic agenda, trying to create these relationships that are just going to create facts on the ground. And I think the U.S. is going to be left behind if we don't develop that clear economic agenda. Some opportunities I'd highlight. I mean, first and foremost, for me, just looking at where we stand, especially compared to several years ago, I'm amazed by the strength of our allies and partners and the developments that have taken place. Igor touched on some of the diplomatic engagement between Japan and South Korea, which several years ago I think many of us thought would kind of be mired in that issue, but there's been real progress there. Japan, obviously, with Prime Minister Abe's kind of bold defense agenda and what he's been able to achieve there is really impressive. And Japan's bringing a lot more, I think, to the alliance in terms of the defense relationship. South Korea, despite all of the recent political problems, again, you think about a country that's gone through a major political crisis, thousands of demonstrators in the streets, impeachment of a president, yet there's no civil war, people aren't actually fighting. We'll see what happens with the election, but again, I think it shows the strength of South Korean democracy. Even again, in the face of a lot of renewed threats from North Korea, this has all happened too. It is pretty amazing. Obviously, Australia remains essential to our alliance and to everything we're going to do in the future in the region. And in Southeast Asia, there are a lot of positive developments as well. Countries that in the past you would have never expected being interested in deepening their ties with the U.S., partly, I would argue, because of China's antics and efforts in South China Sea has kind of driven some of these countries closer to us. So there's a lot of potential there. The one, the one ally which obviously I think we need to express some concern about, and I think there's bipartisan concern in the Senate certainly about, is the Philippines and President Duterte and what he's been doing certainly internally. That said, I was in the Philippines late last year, and I think there's still Filipino democracy, I think, is still strong. I think over time that we'll figure out how to handle this situation. I think that's still going to be an important relationship. And then stepping out a little bit broader, obviously, Taiwan remains essential. There's a strong congressional support to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and I think we're hoping for some developments there on a new arms sale package here in the coming months, hopefully. Stepping further out, India remains a country with great potential, I think, for deeper U.S. partnership. And I was struck on a recent visit to India, their optimism about the new administration and about the potential for deepening our ties. And for, quite frankly, the interesting evolution of the strategic debate in India about China, which I think has become much clearer over the last several years, and Indian leaders, I think, are much more willing to kind of talk about the coming decades and what the region's going to look like as their role evolves and as China does as well. The second opportunity, which is really thanks to the Trump administration's early budget plans, is just, I think we're starting to deal with sequestration once and for all. Obviously, I think there's still some concern that the numbers that we're seeing with the defense increase are not what many leaders in the Senate, like Senator McCain, would like to see. But the reality is that's a good first step. And if we can show that we're committed to our defense, I think that's going to send a strong message to our allies and partners in the region. And it's also going to allow Admiral Harris and others in military PACOM to do the things they need to do to continue to show that the U.S. is going to be present. The one thing that Senator Rubio has always advocated is, while we address the sequestration issues, we need to start looking at other ways to enhance our posture in the region and expand things like maybe moving a second carrier over time to the region, I think, would be another way to send a strong signal about U.S. intentions. The third opportunity, despite the debates we have about America's role in the world and whether we should do more or less, I mean, I think the fundamentals, as Igor mentioned, this is a region that we're going to have to be engaged in economically. It's a region that U.S. engagement can bring very beneficial results to the American people. And I think it's a region that it's easier to have a conversation with our constituents about. I think it's a region where, like I said before, we have strong partners. It's not the U.S. just doing everything alone. Our partners in the region, like I outlined, are already stepping up, are already beginning to spend more on defense, are already taking on more of the burden. And so that's a message, I think, that's made this region so appealing to many members of Congress who have decided to remain engaged on these issues. The other strength we have, in addition to that, just the fundamentals of that economic relationship with Asia, is the ongoing strength of our values, as Igor mentioned. And this is something that Senator Rubio in particular has spent a lot of time focused on. He's the chair of this Congress of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which is the human rights-focused China Commission. I think we need to be very careful and not forget that our values and the democratic allies that we have, are one of our most powerful tools when we debate, the future of the Asia-Pacific, the future implications of the rise of China. And I think, countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, I mean, these are all shining examples of what can be achieved by, democratic countries that allow their people to speak freely, have religious freedom. And that's something that I think often pretty much every administration doesn't capitalize on the way they should. And so I think certainly Senator Rubio, many other members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, feel that it's their role to speak out on these issues and to remind the administration of that, as well as remind other countries, whether it's China or others in the region, who need to make progress in those areas. One just minor example I'll mention that the CECC is having a hearing on next week is Hong Kong, where we've kind of seen a creeping authoritarianism, which is very troubling given the arrangement originally between the British and the Chinese government. And so we'll have some of the leaders of the Umbrella Movement and other activists from Hong Kong testifying on Capitol Hill next week. And so that's one small example, but I think it's an important role that Congress can always play to continue to raise these issues going forward. So all in all, I'd just say I think there remains a lot of potential for the U.S. policy in the region, and I think some of the early signs are very positive with this administration, as Igor mentioned, just paying the time and attention that often has escaped some of our partners from what I've heard from embassies has been very appreciated. And I think as they fill the remaining political appointee slots, I think it's more and more likely that that's just going to increase over time. And so I think right now the mood in Congress is pretty optimistic about where we're going to go on Asia policy.
Good, thank you. That was a surprisingly optimistic note right there, right at the end. It got me off guard. I want to open it up to questions, but first I just wanted to say that I spend a lot of time thinking about congressional power and the impact on foreign policy and Asia policy in particular. Granted, from maybe a little bit of an academic perspective, not always completely politically relevant, but it's fair to say Congress can play a stabilizing role in American foreign policy and Asia policy, and you pointed to some of the examples of that, especially Taiwan. There's a lot of discussion now about Taiwan, especially given these interviews over the last 24 hours. The support for Taiwan is structural in the U.S., and much of it resides in the U.S. Congress. Donald Trump or any other president can't just decide like that to change U.S. Taiwan policy. And I would say that applies to several other foreign policy issues as well. So, we, I think, default usually in our analysis and sort of our attention in the media, we default to executive branch perspective on everything in foreign policy. But the fact is, Congress shares half of the powers that govern foreign policy, and on trade policy in particular, it governs more than half of the power. So when we're speculating about who's going into government and who's the next assistant secretary of whatever, we should also stop to think about we've got some good people in Congress too in somewhat analogous roles. And I'm just very pleased to have people like Igor and Jamie at the helm in Congress helping their bosses and their bosses being the leaders that they are to provide some of this stability in our Asia policy over the long term. So with that, let me open it up to questions. Yeah. Nadia, right here. Thank
you.
You're not Nadia, are you?
Thank you, Walter. Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. First questions for Jamie. You mentioned, Congress expecting a big package of arms sales to Taiwan. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Especially President Tsai mentioned in her interview, Taiwan is interested in, purchasing F-35. Do you think there's any support in the Congress? And second question is, since you actually mentioned after Mar-a-Lago meeting, the North Korea issue seems to be the dominant issue that for the U.S. and China relationship. I think including Taiwan, somebody, your airlines and friends in Asia is worrying that will be the only focus driving this relationship. President Trump even praised, Xi Jinping his love for Chinese people. I don't think it was shared by all Chinese, because Xi Jinping was seen as the tightened its control and put a lot of people into jail. So will human rights still be an issue at all for the administration? Will Congress really monitor and put some pressure on this? Thank you.
I think just on your second question, I noted my personal concern that we can't see the entire U.S.-China relationship through the prism of North Korea. I do think we're early, though. I mean, clearly recent developments by the Kim Jong-un regime require the U.S. to make North Korea a priority right now. We're basically several weeks into this administration effort to get new steps from the Chinese to actually pressure North Korea. So I think it's too early to predict that this is going to be something the administration is going to pursue for 4 years. I think we need to see what the Chinese are actually willing to do, how far they go. There are a lot of other things, though. Obviously, I mean, China is not the only solution to the North Korea problem. I'm not even sure that China can actually solve the North Korea problem, no matter what it does. There are a lot of other things the U.S., I think, is doing and should be doing, and Senator Gardner and Igor have worked on a lot of these. The House is, I think, passing a bill next week with some new North Korea sanctions. There's broad support for toughening sanctions, I think, in the Congress. There are other things that, for years, I mean, many administrations have not been willing to take some of the tough measures to actually go after North Korea leadership assets, to finally get other countries to shut down North Korean embassies, which basically are used to profit and assist the regime. So there's a lot that can be done there, both some through our cooperation with China and other things that the U.S. can just do unilaterally. And so I'm assuming they're going to pursue a lot of those measures as well. On the arms sale package, I mean, I think Walter's right. I mean, Congress has played a key role ever since the Taiwan Relations Act in making sure that the U.S. continues to stand by Taiwan, continues to sell arms to Taiwan. I don't think the administration, as far as I know, Igor can maybe chime in if he knows more than I do, has gotten to the point where they have a specific package already ready that they briefed the Hill on. But I think you can assume from certainly Senator Rubio's perspective and many others in the Senate that there's broad support for pretty much the biggest package we can put together. I know in Taiwan there is a discussion, and the new government has wanted to work on indigenous defense capability and production. So I know that the new government has certain ideas about what systems that they can actually use versus things that they want to focus on building that capacity in Taiwan, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think the U.S. should do what we can to support those efforts. So I don't know if Igor wants to add anything on that.
Just agree with, sorry, with everything that James said. I would say just on North Korea, the point that makes this a very sort of dangerous point, and again, going to what Admiral Harris said yesterday, sort of the most dangerous he's seen, and other commanders have said this, is that this leader in North Korea is not afraid to fail. Which is, you know, the amount of testing, I mean, the amount of failures that they've, but from each they learn, and they're not afraid to put new models together and cobble things together, and what we've seen is that the program is pretty much indigenized in the sense that they have all the things they need. There's probably still, you know, things that are going over, and we've seen open source reporting that there's still components that are going through China and so forth. We don't know whether the Chinese government knows about this, or it's sort of a network of dealers there that they might not even be aware of. But that's what makes this very dangerous, is that, you know, he's consolidated power and has picked up the testing and in the sense that, you know, we will make fun of it occasionally, but it's actually every failure is a learning opportunity for the regime. So I think it's right for the administration to focus on this tactically at first, and make sure that the regime in Pyongyang understands that we do have the capabilities and all options are on the table. I think my boss agrees that should be the policy, except that we should exercise diplomatic and economic options, which we have plenty, as Jamie mentioned. I mean, we even had sort of David Cohen, who was the Obama administration sort of, I think he was the Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Deputy Secretary of the CIA, is that right? And he wrote this great op-ed in in the Washington Post that said that, pointed out just some facts that in no way have we exercised the economic leverage that we have on North Korea. There's tons more, and as I mentioned sort of in my opening remarks, there's a lot more that we can do. When they were working the Iran sanctions piece, Treasury sent folks out to every country and put them to a choice. You either do business with this regime or you do business with the United States. Which economy would you rather have? A $17 trillion U.S. economy, or at that point was it half a billion dollar Iranian economy? And most, if not all, said, yep, choose the U.S. And that's how we got there. And that's the kind of effort we need. It needs to be a whole government effort to make sure that maximum pressure is maximum pressure. And this is where the Hill is important, is that we can sort of, we can make sure that those laws are implemented. Again, we passed a comprehensive piece of legislation last Congress, and we expect its complete fulfillment. I'm not aware of a new arms sales package to Taiwan, but I would agree 100% with Jamie. There'd be broad support. We have an obligation under the TRA to support, defensive arms to Taiwan, and my boss is fully on board, and I think he would support it wholeheartedly. We'd have to see the details and go through the process, but we hadn't seen anything yet. And just to pick up another Jamie's point, I mean, another piece of it is that we need to see folks in place in the administration up and down the bureaucracies to be able to effectively implement these policies, and we're hoping that happens soon.
Just a brief comment on the arms sales package and the F-35 in particular. I mean, there's a sequencing issue here, which is that Taiwan has to make a decision or put together a package of things that it wants, and that has been subject of some of the news over the last day about what they would want in a package. And as I read Tsai Ing-wen's comments, she was saying F-35 should be an option, right? But I would advise that she look to other options, because the F-35 is just not going to be made available to Taiwan. The focus on it in Taiwan, at some level, mystifies me, because I don't understand why they want to insist on something they can't have. We messed around with the F-16 now for 9 years. If Taiwan really wants new fighter aircraft, let's focus on the F-16. That's something that they can most likely get. And they can get a very high quality, top-of-the-line F-16. We can get the best possible outfitted fighter aircraft we can with the F-16 and move forward with that. But we need Taiwan to make some realistic choices and put together a package for us before we can process it on this side.
Can I just add to that? I think it's an important note that Walter made. And from the F-16 debate, I mean, I think you had many strong supporters of Taiwan in Congress willing to provide or fight to provide Taiwan with just about any variant of the F-16 they wanted. And then I think at the time with the previous government, because of budgetary issues, certain things just didn't make sense. And so I fully agree. It's really, Taiwan needs to decide kind of what resources they're willing to allocate to this, whether they really need something like the F-35, as well as how it fits in their broader defense agenda. And the other thing, which many in this room probably know better than me, but I was struck the last time I was there too. I mean, President Tsai has a very ambitious domestic agenda, and they have to figure out how many resources they're willing to allocate to defense. Obviously, I think from an ally perspective, the U.S. should be encouraging Taiwan to continue to increase defense spending. But at the end of the day, I mean, these are very expensive systems, and they need to be the ones who are making those initial choices and then starting that discussion with the U.S.
Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. Eun-jung Cho with the Voice of America. My question goes to Igor. Congressman Ed Royce's new North Korea sanctions bill will be put on the vote in the House floor next week. And I'm interested in what discussions are currently underway in the Senate regarding this bill. Is there a strong support for this bill? And does Senator Gardner plan to introduce his own version of the same bill as he did in the last Congress? Thank you.
As I mentioned, I think we support any and all efforts to make more options available for the administration to put more pressure on the regime. You know, I've seen the bill. It's it's a great bill. We're going to wait and what comes over, and we'll sort of, right now the focus for my boss is seeing what the administration can do with the tools that it has. And it has a lot of tools based on the previous bill. I think, again, Chairman Royce has done tremendous work on this, and we're happy to take a look at this bill. Obviously, Chairman of the committee, Chairman Corker, and the ranking member will have a lot to say, and they have actually all the authority to put things on the agenda, and we're happy to work with them. But right now the focus is, for my boss, is the legislation we're developing and putting a comprehensive Asia policy together, working in concert with the administration, working in concert with our colleagues in Congress. And as Jamie mentioned, I think the danger is to just keep this laser-like focus on North Korea because it's in the news, and again, tactically it's the right thing to do, but we need to have a broader scope. We need to look at the region, more broadly, and we need to put together a good, solid framework, policy framework together. So that's what my boss's focus is. But certainly we don't looking at the content of the bill, it has a lot of modifications. It has some other things that are good. But again, the administration needs to enforce the laws that are already on the books, and we're hoping that we see a very robust package of sanctions that will be coming our way, of designations and other actions, like Jamie mentioned, and going around and convincing folks to shut down avenues of illicit sort of activities, illicit earnings for the regime. And so we're hoping that that's going to be the focus of the administration right now. So.
Yes, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. I have a question about the IMF treaty. I believe that was just between this, I think it was the Soviet Union and the United States. I think it's a pretty old treaty, but I think we're still obligated by the treaty, but many other countries like China, Pakistan, India, Iran, they're not signatories to the INF treaty. So since the time it was signed, they've built up their missile posture, and I'm wondering, what is our best response to the missile posture in the new environment?
I mean, that's an issue that we've followed a bit for the last couple of years, given the press reports about potential Russian deployment of a system which would violate their commitments under the treaty. It does have implications, I think, for our allies and partners in Asia. Obviously, U.S. forces in the Asia-Pacific are also right now bound by the obligations of that treaty. I mean, I think there's certainly been Republican interest in Congress prior to the Trump administration, not necessarily in immediately withdrawing from the treaty, but doing a review of whether we should remain obligated under the treaty, and also having DOD. There's been, I think, resolutions, maybe a bill that I think we and Senator Cotton and others introduced to allow DOD to begin to do some research and development to look at, if the U.S. eventually withdraws from the treaty, what systems we could develop to deal with certainly the Russian threat. But your point is a good one, and quite frankly, I mean, I think the Russians in the past, going back to the Bush administration, have made the same point about China and other countries in the Asia-Pacific developing their missile capabilities, and the Russians have argued that the treaty is now irrelevant, and they haven't withdrawn formally, but now they appear to be violating it. And so you could have a conversation about whether there should be an attempt to either get rid of the treaty entirely or to expand it. Now, I think if you try to convince Beijing and others to sit down with the U.S. and Russia and negotiate some new framework, you're probably going to spend years doing that, and probably I'm very skeptical that you're actually going to negotiate something that everyone's going to agree to abide by. But that's a very real issue, and I think it's one that, as far as I know, the Trump administration is also looking at right now as they figure out in the U.S.-Russian context how we should react to these Russian violations.
Good. Yeah. Right here.
Thank you for coming. Mitsuo Nakai is my name. I've said regarding North Korea, I've said this over and over, and I can say it again. The sanction is a long-term solution. It works slow. So I'm not really crazy about it unless we hit where it hurts. I've mentioned this to the senator once before. There is Chinese bank that goes through here, and that's providing some monies to North Korea. And unless we shut that one down, it's not going to do us any good. So my question is, obviously, is your senator working on that just as well, or?
Well, I agree with you. But we're not the Treasury Department, and again, I think the administration. I completely agree with you. We in Congress, like our role is to set policy and give authorizations for the administrations in a direction to do certain things, and we've done that, and we hope that again, the point of secondary, right, is a step further, not just doing business with the bad guy, but people doing business with the people who are doing business with the bad guy, the way it's right. And let's do that. Let's prohibit all correspondent accounts from going through U.S. banks. Let's basically prohibit all dollar-denominated transactions. And I agree with you. Let's hit them where it hurts. We had a very successful, by all accounts, in 2007, the BDA action was worked, and as much as I think we all love passing new sanctions, that was done under the Patriot Act, I believe, Section 311, and that's still on the books. Let's go use it. I think again, maximum pressure. Let's all get together and find out what works, what doesn't, where the regime keeps its money, where we can find things that create the most leverage for us. Because again, at the end of the day, and I believe the new term for the policy is maximum pressure and engagement, and I think we're also, there are some comments yesterday that were made that obviously the administration agrees that this is a peaceful denuclearization, and that they would like this current regime in North Korea to come to the conclusion that nuclear weapons and this robust ballistic program is not in their national interest, and that the United States does not seek regime change. And that will require at some point some set of negotiations in whatever format, whether it's six-party talks, but I think for my boss, and he said this publicly, any notion of a negotiation that forgets the past 30 years, 20 years is it really should be a non-starter, because then we've allowed them to pursue this program with absolutely no penalty. We can't start from a blank slate, so let's start with the 2005 agreed framework and the commitments made under that, and maybe go from there.
I was just going to add, I think the point Igor has been making is an important one, because I know there's always a lot of attention in the press and our partners and those who often target the sanction focus on the congressional debate about a specific piece of sanctions legislation. But as Igor has noted, the reality is in almost every case, the eventual sanctions are imposed through executive authorities. It's relatively rare that, I think Iran might be in some cases with actually the congressionally imposed sanctions were used, but we've seen this certainly in my boss's work on Venezuela. We saw it in the debate about Russia sanctions. I mean, Congress can pass these sanctions bills, but they're usually only meant to just send a message to the administration about, we want you to do more, and then the administration uses its own authorities under IEPA or others to actually figure out kind of which financial institutions to target or how far to go. And I think in North Korea, that's very much the case. As we've said several times, the administration has extensive authorities. They could do a new Bank of Delta Asia. They could target all kinds of other North Korean activity. They don't need Congress to pass more legislation to do that. And like Igor, Igor has said, his boss and others led this effort last year, and so I think there's a sense that there are a lot of authorities already out there. Congress has gone on record. The House will go on record again next week, it looks like. But the administration can go ahead right now if they want to on any of these areas.
Can I, just a follow-up question, especially to Igor, since he mentioned the past 20 years, you can't really look at this issue with North Korea and out of the context of the last 20 years. Is there any concern in Congress with the way the administration is developing its relationship with China? I mean, the naivety of it is shocking, in fact. The idea that despite the evidence of the last 20 years of lack of cooperation from the Chinese on North Korea, it seems that the president has sort of an unlimited faith in the ability and the good intentions of Xi Jinping, a good man who cares about his country, loves his country. I mean, is there any concern developing in Congress with the way U.S.-China relations are developing, especially with regard to this issue?
I would say that this is just speaking in sort of personal capacity here. I would say there is a danger in personalization of foreign policy, which is why we're working on a broad piece of legislation that puts a framework, a policy framework together that's multifaceted and so forth. So I would say if there is a sense of, there is, I think, some good that can be done by developing a relationship that can provide some short-term benefits on this issue, and maybe, you know, again, but it has to be in concert with other things. You know, the first thing it has to be in concert of is making sure that we have the PRC fully and faithfully implement the United Nations commitments it agreed to. You know, and make sure that the coal, you know, all of these issues need to be sort of, you know, trust and verify, I guess, is my goal. But is there a sense, and like I mentioned in my remarks, we should try to stay away from things becoming transactional and look at them broadly and strategically and long term. Again, my boss has mentioned, we hope this administration can set a policy for this region that's not just a 4-year policy, but it's a 40-year policy, right? Let's look at the trends, because that's how our friends in Beijing think, right? They don't think quite in those little chunks of time that we think in. So that's kind of my.
Can I just say, which I don't say often, but in defense of the administration's approach, I already flagged the broader concern about focusing too much on North Korea and our U.S.-China relations. But I will say, I think the one thing they are doing the right way on this compared to what the Obama administration had tried. If you remember, I mean, there were times when Secretary Kerry actually went out to the region and upfront offered unilateral concessions from the U.S. perspective to try to lure the Chinese. I think it was related to missile defense in South Korea, saying preemptively, we will do X, Y, and Z, China, if you do more. I think the administration has shied away from that thus far, which is the right thing to do, and instead actually up the ante for the Chinese and deployed THAAD now, moved quickly to do it, showed the Chinese that if the status quo with North Korea persists, that this is not going to be a good strategic environment for Beijing. And I actually think that's the right way, if you're going to engage China in this discussion, to do this, to remind Beijing both of the threat that North Korea even poses to them, but to show them that the U.S. presence in the region is also going to have to increase and be deployed in certain ways if this North Korean threat continues to develop. And just go ahead and do it, and then see what the Chinese response is, rather than try to preemptively offer to concede, which it really was the Obama approach. And so I think they've gotten that aspect of it right. But again, I think the real test will be 6 months from now, are we still talking about U.S.-China relations entirely through the discussion about coal shipments or whatever China has done on financial institutions? I think that personally will be a problem, and I think you'll see more members of Congress probably concerned at that point if we're still not making any progress with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, I agree with that distinction, although at least as of, you know, overnight, it does seem that the president is willing to shape our Taiwan policy, partly contingent on the relationship with China and what they can do on North Korea. I mean, he said it so explicitly, right, that I don't want to talk to Tsai Ing-wen because, you know, I've got these things going with the Chinese and they're being so helpful, more helpful than they've ever been in history, and I don't want to jeopardize that. So there already does seem to be some indication that they're not immune to making concessions in order to gain Chinese compliance.
I mean, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what the readout from the administration is today about the Taiwan comments and what they mean. The only thing I'd say in response is we have seen the phone call during the transition, which I think was a major development and a positive development. And you know, many here may know better than I, but I think beneath the surface, there have also been other small signs of how this administration views Taiwan. I think there was a large conference on countering ISIS at the State Department, where Taiwan was actually invited to participate and sit on the stage as a participant, which I think was maybe a small signal, but one that I don't think the previous administration would have done. My understanding is there's some lower level conversations even going on in Taipei this week with certain U.S. officials were sent to. So I think we've seen a number of those indications, and that's an area where I think there's bipartisan support in Congress for more. We're actually looking at some options to send a message from certainly the Senate in the coming weeks about the importance of increasing travel of U.S. officials to Taiwan and allowing senior Taiwanese officials to come to the U.S. on a more frequent basis without having to go through the kind of case-by-case approval that is often there. So I think the concern is noted, but I think there are also other ways that this administration has shown that it's willing to move beyond some of the recent history in U.S. Taiwan policy.
Thank you. Yeah, in the back.
Stanley Kober. There's a story today in Reuters, an interview with the president. And among other things, he says he intends to renegotiate or terminate the free trade agreement with South Korea. And this has taken some of the markets by surprise that at this time, he would stress this. He said, I'm announcing it now. And I would like to ask the panelists about this, both in terms of the political implications of making this announcement right now and the economic implications, because my understanding is South Korea's trade has been in trouble, declining for the last couple of years, the volume of trade. So this could put some economic pressure on South Korea.
I've seen the comments. You know, I think, again, I can only speak for my boss. I can't, you know, we haven't gotten readouts on what that will mean in practice and how that's going to be sort of timeframes and the implementation. So we'll have to see how that's flushed out. My boss strongly supports THAAD deployment. He supported the U.S. Free Korea Trade Agreement. I think a lot in Congress have that position. I'm going to leave it there. So.
I think Vice President Pence mentioned this as well when he was in South Korea, and like Igor says, I don't think there's been a briefing or anything provided to the Congress yet about what exactly the plans are. The only thing I'd say is, as we've seen with NAFTA, there's a lot of discussion about revising agreements. Some people always view that as disastrous. It depends on what the administration's intentions are. If they really just want to tear up trade agreements, that's obviously problematic. But you can argue with almost any trade agreement that's been in place for several years, there are always problems, there are always issues related to implementation. Senator Rubio is a strong supporter of KORUS. However, certain industries in our state, the citrus industry, had major problems initially with implementation of the agreement. We raised that, and Senator Rubio raised that in Seoul in the last several years. We've felt we've got some developments, but there are other issues like that that always pop up, and so if the administration's intention is to try to work through issues that have come up as these agreements have been implemented, I think there's probably going to be support for that. It just depends on ultimately what their plan is. But in the bigger scheme of things, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It would be helpful, I think, if as the administration gets its team in place, that they develop a coherent economic agenda rather than these one-off comments, because I think that starts to concern people. But if they can come up with a plan about how they're going to modernize existing agreements, develop new FTAs, I think the reception in the region would be much more positive.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of style, basically. I mean, it's not unreasonable to look at an agreement that's 20 years old, or in the case of KORUS, less than that. It's not unreasonable to look at it and try to modernize it and that sort of thing. And there are mechanisms within the agreement to do that. It's really a style how you approach it, and maybe it hasn't been approached in the most constructive way. But I think here, too, Congress has a role to play. There's this piece of legislation that Mike Lee has introduced called the Global Trade Accountability Act, where he goes through and closes all of the discretion that the president has to unilaterally overturn trade agreements and that sort of thing. And I think given, announcements over the last month or so with regard to trade initiatives, it'd be a good thing to really look at. This is, it doesn't make sense to me that Congress can work with a president 20 years ago to pass an agreement, and that agreement is comprised of a piece of legislation that goes through Congress at great debate, et cetera, and then 20 years later, the President of the United States unilaterally can turn that agreement off, like NAFTA. It doesn't make sense. I think there should be some more accountability for any administration on trade issues, and Congress needs to stand up and assert its own constitutional prerogatives in that regard.
I'll just very quickly add to this. that in terms of trade and looking at the region, we know right now the administration is developing their policy. I mean, there's a lot of things coming out that are contradictory, but we've also tried to encourage them, from my boss, but not a trade expert, to look at other ways to generate trade activity, right? I mean, it's not all about tariffs and things. It's trade capacity building, it's trade facilitation, all the things we've been doing in the region. Let's ramp that up. Let's make sure we have some of these efforts going, that we can generate activity and promote U.S. goods and open new markets through maybe some of these non-tariff barriers and things of that nature. So these are the types of things that the administration also can take the lead on and add sort of, you know, to the economic engagement piece, and not get into, I think, a discussion is what's an FTA, what's not an FTA, what's a multilateral agreement, are we allergic to that, are we allergic to this, you know, ISDS and these types of things that have generated a lot of, like, political debate. So I would just very quickly add that's an important component that gets lost in the discussion a lot of times.
Dennis.
I'm Dennis Halpin from the U.S. Korea Institute. On this discussion about Xi Jinping is becoming the new best friend instead of Putin, helping us on everything. As you know, China in February announced that they were going to have an embargo on coal, which is the main legal product North Korea exports, moneymaker. I mean, they export drugs and counterfeit currency and weapons, but anyway, in this regard, I would hope it's been brought up about Congress having oversight and looking. If we're going to make a major policy shift and work with China on all sorts of other issues and give them a new playing field on trade or Taiwan arms sales at the South China Sea, because they're helping on North Korea, we should be looking at the sanctions. And I would just point out, earlier in the week, I think, or late last week, North Korean news reported 4 ships, North Korean ships, they said 3 of which had suspects pass, had been seen bringing coal into a Chinese port. The Chinese Foreign Ministry then said, well, it's humanitarian, we have to let the crew come ashore. And then yesterday, ITV, the British news, you can look it up, yesterday at dawn, for some reason they had a film crew in Dandong, where the railroad bridge is, and there's a report, a whole train full of coal crossing the North Korean border into China that they filmed. So, if Mr. Xi, and President Trump has called China's coal import ban a big step forward on reining in North Korea. So my question for the Congress is this: if Xi Jinping is going to be seen as the great facilitator of solving North Korea, then are we going to see that there's accountability? If China says we're going to have an import ban for 2017 on North Korean coal imports, and then you have trains, well, not trains, planes, and automobiles, but trains, ships, and trucks still pouring coal across the North Korean border, is this going to be looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I'm complete agreement. I think it needs to be results-based, and the Congress has the authorities and the ability to demand from the administration the relevant briefings, even certifications if necessary, about what China is or is not doing. It's not a new challenge, obviously, and I don't think it's provocative to say there's a lot of skepticism in the U.S. Congress, probably on both the Democratic and Republican sides, about whether China is going to be serious. I mean, I've worked on proliferation for a number of years, and you saw the same thing with China's lack of implementation of various UNSCRs and their public statements that they were complying with all UNSCRs, preventing certain shipments, and then just the U.S. government having evidence to the contrary. So I think it's something we need to be very careful about. Stepping back from North Korea specifically, the other concern and the reason I expressed some worry about the focus on North Korea is I think we just also need to pay attention to the other things China is doing. I mean, I worry that the South China Sea discussion, which I thought had received increased attention, good discussion, certainly in the press, certainly more interest from members of Congress than perhaps had been the case in the past, now is kind of not being talked about anymore, either when we get the readouts of some of these meetings. And I think that actually plays into Beijing's hand, and I think if I were them, I'd be exploiting this opportunity maybe to do even some more provocative things. One of the things we've tried to do, Senator Rubio and Senator Cardin introduced a bill that would actually impose sanctions on certain Chinese entities if some of this island building continues. I mean, it's very easy to actually identify, even using unclassified sources, a lot of the Chinese entities that are involved in the land reclamation, building some of the facilities, running some of the charter airlines to these islands. And so that's one thing we've laid out there to actually start a conversation. The early signals from the administration were actually pretty positive. Now Secretary Tillerson was asked about this during his confirmation and expressed an openness to explore some of those tools as we followed China's activity in South China Sea. And so I think that's my biggest worry actually about the North Korea discussion. I mean, I think we'll have a test here in the coming months about whether China does take real action, but I also think we just can't get distracted from some of the other challenges that we face in the broader region, and challenges that are threats both to the openness of commerce, but also threats to our allies and partners.
I'll just very quickly add, I mean, that's right. I mean, and this is why, when they were negotiating UNSCR 2270, the livelihood exemption was there for this very case that you said. They said, something shows up and say, okay, well, we let that in because it was humanitarian and it was livelihood and so forth. And so we need to have a strategy also at the United Nations, and an enforcement strategy, and how we communicate those things and how we track those things, and how there was just a panel of experts report that identified a lot of gaps. That are not just China specific. I mean, a lot of countries don't even submit their reports on how they're implementing DPRK sanctions, right? And so that needs to be, again, a whole of government effort that's not necessarily even just China specific, but obviously the big piece of this will be the PRC, on how we look at the sanctions piece and at the pressure piece, and we have a lot of abilities to affect that. And I hope the administration uses all of those tools. And Congress is happy to provide them, but again, as Jamie was saying, they're tools, right? And, they get to swing the hammer. We get to, allow them to do that, I guess, if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you. Good morning. Ed Stewart from Prism Group. Jamie, I'm glad you raised South China Sea. That's what my question centers on. And what future role do you see for the Hill playing as this episode unfolds? It will, and especially like any of you all to comment on what I see as the jitteriness of a lot of the claimant states in the South China Sea right now, who aren't quite sure where the U.S. stance is on South China Sea. As Jamie said, it was receiving good, widespread bipartisan support in the last year and has sort of been tamped down. But how do we reassure our partners and allies in the region as well on U.S. stance there? Thank you.
I think it's an important question, and some of it I already touched on. I mean, I think Congress can lead the way in proposing new tools, like I mentioned the sanctions possibility, which, obviously we're probably a little ways away from, but to start that conversation. I think Congress can also play a role, as it has in prodding administrations to be more firm in their public statements if it comes to that about certain claims. I mean, if you look at the East China Sea and the Senkakus, that's a case where I think there was a lot of bipartisan pressure actually led to the Obama administration making the right statements through multiple secretaries of state. I think there was, that Secretary Tillerson was asked very clearly about the Senkakus during his confirmation hearing. I think it helped press him, and now I think it was repeated in the president's, certainly his meeting statement with Prime Minister Abe, a firm U.S. commitment to the defense of the Senkaku. So I think that's one small little case, again, related to East China Sea, where Congress can play a role in reminding the administration of our obligations in those areas. I agree, though, with the gist of your question, just to note that this discussion maybe has become a little bit less clear over the last year. Some of that's just events out of our control, obviously, and I think a lot of it personally is due to the reaction to the UNCLOS ruling and the Duterte government kind of taking over. I think if we had a different policy from the Philippines, maybe in the wake of the UNCLOS ruling, there would have been kind of a continuation of the path we were on. The U.S. and so many of other partners put so much stock in the UNCLOS ruling. I don't think that we've been able to capitalize on what was, at the end of the day, a pretty good ruling in the way we could have if we had a different government in Manila. And so that's just is what it is, and we got to deal with that right now. I do think that obviously the ruling stands, and so we'll see where that debate goes in the coming years. You know, one thing the U.S. eventually is going to have to decide as China continues to ignore things like the UNCLOS ruling, continues the island building, now is militarizing some of the islands, at what point we change our fundamental policy of not taking a position on claims. And that's just something I think that my boss has not, you know, come up with a clear statement on. I mean, he's just said we need to start thinking about what that might look like. That's a pretty provocative step, but again, I think there are several members of Congress who have spoken about that in the past. There are members of Congress like Senator Rubio, Senator McCain, and others who have taken a position on the Senkakus, for instance, that is not official U.S. policy. And so again, that's a way where I think Congress can kind of start some of these conversations and keep them on the agenda of this administration.
Just very quickly, I mean, I agree with everything sort of Jamie's been saying, and we sort of, again, the situation there and the response from the Philippines, and you know, you were there, and luckily we're still a treaty ally, and there are still a lot of folks there to speak to. Maybe if the president's not willing to, certainly I think the defense establishment, the foreign policy establishment in the Philippines is still pretty firmly pro-American and can have those conversations. But yes, I would agree we missed an opportunity with the UNCLOS ruling to have a concerted diplomatic pressure track that could lead to some maybe region-wide. Again, I think one of my boss's fears has been that President Duterte decides that you know, he's going to go and do this bilateral negotiation, and then because I think that they'll be pretty clearly outmatched in that discussion in the variety of tools that China has. So again, this is another big challenge for the administration, and FONOPS is just one part of it, right? I mean, there's quite a many other things, including, again, I mean, we can all be conservationists on this issue. I think a lot of things we can be saying about the massive destruction of, you know, the sea life and coral reefs and all of these things. You know, this is an opportunity for us. You know, this is an opportunity for us to bipartisan way become, you know, and point these things out. And that we're hoping that all of those issues will be part of a policy.
The Chinese say that they are destroying the coral reef in the most environmentally sensitive way possible. So,
yeah, it's good to know.
They actually say that. I mean, honestly, I didn't make that one up. You know, the last couple of years, there's been a conversation about creating a reporting requirement on freedom of navigation's operations in the NDAA, particularly maybe a quarterly requirement that requires president to say what they have done recently. Is that still something possible, that kind of thing, or is it subsumed now in the larger kind of political change? You know, that was over a time with a Republican Congress and a Democrat president. Has that changed now? Is there more trust in the president to do the right thing on FONOPS, or do we need still some accountability mechanism?
I mean, it's a FONOPS program. I think has been around since 1976, if I'm not mistaken. So, and I think it's a regularized program. So I think there is already some reporting. I'm not an expert, but I think there's already some reporting requirements on this.
I think an annual
right.
requirement.
I certainly think any tool we can have. I mean, if you were to come in and ask me, would my boss co-sponsor that amendment? Absolutely. You know, we'd vote for it and co-sponsor it. I mean, more accountability, better. And a lot of times, you know, that's how we agree on things. You know, can't agree on policy. We always agree on reporting requirements, right? We like to engage people in the bureaucracies to give us paper for various reasons. But you know, I think it comes from, you know, if there is a concerted policy with the understanding on where we want to get with these FONOP operations, and there was a lot of sort of hand-wringing in the Obama administration on what was a FONOP and what was innocent passage and these terms, and so I think if there's some clarity and some clear statements from this administration, and again yesterday, you know, Admiral Harris, I mean his testimony went into depth and again said that they're going to resume it. So I think we're behind that.
Yeah, I think there's broad support. And the other thing I just note is this administration has talked a lot about devolving command authority, for instance, in Iraq and Syria and the fight against ISIS. I mean, this is an area where we shouldn't need a White House meeting to decide whether to do a follow-up. And I'm not saying that that's the current policy. I don't honestly know what level those decisions are made in this administration. But I think that was the one concern that many in Congress had at the end of the last administration. There was just too much discussion and debate, and it had to go up to very senior levels before people felt comfortable making these decisions. And this is something that should be decided at much lower levels and should become very routine. It shouldn't be that we have to have a lot of back and forth. And the other aspect of this, which I think is important, and I think the U.S. has been trying to do this, I hope the current administration continues, is we need to get more countries involved too. And this cannot just be U.S.-only operations. We need to get our partners and allies to participate, to do these both with us as well as by themselves, if they have ships transiting through the region, to kind of even make a slight detour if necessary, just to make a point. And so that's something that I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, agree. Let's take one more question right here on the end.
Thank you both. I'm Theo Sitter from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Jamie, you certainly mentioned this, mentioned the budget. I am wondering if you both can comment on what proposed cuts to the State Department and USAID would have on the region, particularly around democracy and human rights promotion. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I should have mentioned earlier, I mean, I think I meant to talk about earlier as we deal with sequestration on the military side and make sure our defense posture is adequate in the region. A huge component needs to also be our civilian activity, both our, you know, official diplomatic engagement, the people we have at embassies. I'm not sure that we ever had a diplomatic rebalance. We certainly didn't in terms of the high-profile visits, but even just kind of looking at U.S. embassies and consulates and making sure that we have all of the diplomats we need in the right places, economic officers and others. So that's very important. Certainly my boss has been very outspoken about his concerns about the rumored budget cuts, both what we saw in the budget outline as well as just some of the things that have come out more recently in the press. This is a region which is going to be essential to the future of U.S. national security in the coming decades, and I think it's a region that needs to be prioritized. And we're starting from a situation where it probably wasn't receiving the resources it needed, and now everything's getting cut, and so I think we need to be very careful about cutting more vis-a-vis programs, both, like I said, our actual representation in the region as well as democracy, human rights, economic engagement programs. And I think there's a bipartisan group of senators, certainly, I haven't followed the debate in the House as much, who have already weighed in, written letters, expressed concern. Senator Rubio is on the Appropriations Committee now and on Senator Graham's subcommittee on State and Foreign Ops, and so I assume this is going to be an area that there's going to be a lot of discussion about. And going back to Walter's earlier point about Congress's role, this is where area at the end of the day, Congress sets the numbers. And so the administration can submit a budget and make recommendations, but I don't believe that certainly the level of cuts that the administration has proposed to the international affairs budget are going to stand and make it through Congress.
I think my boss shares that perspective. You know, I think just by numbers, I mean, this region was receiving 1% of the foreign military financing of the United States government, and that's, you know, that was sort of honestly the dooming statistic of the rebalance is that, you know, and I think the East Asian Pacific Bureau of State is, I think it's the lowest funded right now. It's a, you know, and those types of, actually in 2013 the Foreign Relations Committee put out a report about these very shortcomings of the rebalance that we're really hoping that this administration will fix. So there'd be a lot of concern about it if there's some ways to make efficiencies and make sure that you know things things work in a way that's most responsive to taxpayer concerns, I think we'd be all for it. I think most of the caucus would be all for it. But you know, I'm gonna repeat this quote. But you know, if we don't fund the State Department, we'll have to buy more ammunition. Yeah, and I won't claim credit for it. Somebody else said it much higher than me. But I think that's where my boss would be, and we'd certainly want to see programs, democracy, human rights, rule of law programs funded, because we know that there are places that have tremendous opportunities. I'll mention Burma or Myanmar. State Department still calls it Burma, so I call it Burma. But tremendous opportunity. I think we supported the administration's sort of efforts, previous administration's efforts to make sure that you know, that democratization kind of, but lots of challenges. You know, you see what's happening in Rakhine State and these other things, and a lot of that doesn't require necessarily resource commitments, but it requires a policy, it requires sort of expertise, it requires you know, folks committed to working these problems and making sure that we're coming at them from a strategic perspective, but also from a values perspective, right? I mean, there are just certain things, even with friends and allies, that are happening in the Philippines, that are happening in Vietnam, that are happening in Burma, that we need to be talking to our partners for and trying to make sure that we express that a partnership with the United States is going to be a comprehensive partnership. We're going to talk about everything. You know, maybe not at the same time, maybe not in the same sort of way. Maybe we weigh things and do them strategically in a way that's quieter, that's, you know, that gets results and so forth. But we need to be talking about these things. We need to have people on the ground that are experts talking about this. We need to engage with civil society. I think, again, Senator Rubio has been a leader on this, but that part of policy, I think, is going to be very important. I think Congress is going to speak pretty loudly on that in a bipartisan way.
Thank you. Well, we have to leave it there. Before I wind up here, though, I wanted to mention two commercials. One is on Monday, we also are having Martin Lee and Joshua Wong over here for a program on Hong Kong and the future of democracy there. I actually hope to get some publicity for Senator Rubio's bill, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And then on the 4th, we have a program called A New Vision for U.S.-India Partnership in the Pacific that we're doing with the Observer Research Foundation, you may be familiar with. So I just want to put those out there, so if you have any interest, you might want to attend those. You know, both of you referenced your previous service on this panel, and I really appreciate it. The reason why we go back to some familiar faces sometimes is it's so hard to get congressional staff up here to do this because you know, they're not usually the ones that are supposed to be making the news. It's their boss's job to make the news. And despite my best attempts here today to get them to make news on a couple issues,
wait, this is on the
they
record?
showed why. Yeah, they showed why their bosses trust them to do this sort of thing. So I really appreciate you guys managing to do this, and I hope you will continue to come back in future years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.